On November 6, 2022, FTX had $16 billion in customer deposits. By November 11th, $8 billion of that was gone, not lost in a market crash, not stolen by hackers, gone because the CEO of a $32 billion company had built a secret backdoor that let his hedge fund take customer money whenever it wanted. And almost nobody knew. This is the story of FTX. Not just the collapse, but the people who built it, the culture that enabled it, and the question at the heart of it all. How did a 29-year-old physics major from MIT convince the most sophisticated investors in the world to give him $32 billion in less than 3 years, with no proof that his company was anything but a well-dressed lie? Sam Bankman-Fried, known to everyone as SBF, was the poster child of cryptocurrency. He was on the cover of Forbes and Fortune. He testified before Congress. He donated $40 million to political campaigns. He was worth $16 billion and lived in a $40 million penthouse in the Bahamas with 10 roommates, wore shorts and t-shirts to meetings, and played League of Legends during calls with Sequoia Capital, the same Sequoia Capital that invested $200 million into his company after that call. The investors called it one of those your hair is blown back type of meetings. But here's what the investors did not know. Behind the scenes, Bankman-Fried and a handful of insiders had built a system that allowed them to take customer deposits from FTX and move them to Alameda Research, his private hedge fund. They spent that money on multi-million-dollar real estate, venture capital investments, political donations, and loans so large they would have made the founders of Enron blush. And they wrote computer code to make sure nobody could see it happening. When the fraud was finally exposed, it took exactly 7 days for the entire empire to collapse. 7 days. The same amount of time it takes for a standard grocery store to restock its shelves. From $32 billion to zero in a single week. That speed is important because it tells us something about FTX that its defenders would rather we forget. This was not a complicated fraud. It was not a series of innocent mistakes by inexperienced executives. It was a deliberate, engineered deception that depended on two things: a lack of oversight and the belief that nobody would look too closely at a company that had Tom Brady on its payroll. The collapse of FTX has been called crypto's Lehman moment. It has been compared to Enron, to Madoff, to every financial fraud in modern American history. Federal prosecutors called it one of the biggest financial frauds in American history, and they were not exaggerating. But the story of FTX is not really about cryptocurrency. It is about human nature. It is about what happens when a brilliant young person convinces himself that the rules do not apply to him, because his goals are noble enough to justify any means. Sam Bankman-Fried called himself an effective altruist. He said he was earning money to give it away to worthy causes. He wanted to prevent pandemics, reduce existential risk, and save the world. And along the way, he stole $8 billion from ordinary people who trusted him. We're going to walk through this step by step. From Bankman-Fried's childhood as the son of Stanford law professors, through his early days at Jane Street Capital, the founding of Alameda Research and FTX, the celebrity hype machine, the discovery of the secret backdoor, the 7-day collapse, the trial that captivated the world, and the question we still have not answered: could this happen again? Sam Bankman-Fried was born on March 5, 1992, in Stanford, California. His parents were both professors at Stanford Law School. His father, Joseph Bankman, was a tax law expert. His mother, Barbara Fried, was a prominent legal scholar. Sam grew up in an environment of academic privilege, where intellectual achievement was not just encouraged, but expected. By all accounts, Sam was a brilliant child. He attended Canada/USA Math Camp, a summer program for mathematically talented high school students. He went to Crystal Springs Upland School, an elite private school in Hillsborough, California. He graduated from MIT in 2014 with a degree in physics and a minor in math. As an MIT student, he lived in a co-ed group house called Epsilon Theta. But there was something different about Sam. From an early age, he seemed to operate on a different frequency from everyone around him. He had trouble reading social cues. He spoke in rapid-fire bursts, often jumping between topics so quickly that listeners struggled to keep up. He rarely made eye contact. He seemed genuinely confused when people took offense at his bluntness. These traits would later be reframed as eccentric genius, the quirky billionaire who eats nothing but vegan food, plays video games during investor calls, and sleeps on a beanbag chair in his office. But they were also red flags that the people around him chose to ignore, because the returns were too good to question. In the summer of 2013, Bankman-Fried interned at Jane Street Capital, a proprietary trading firm known for its quantitative approach to ETF trading. After graduating from MIT, he returned there full-time. Jane Street was a crucible. Traders worked 16-hour days, making split-second decisions that moved millions of dollars. The firm's culture was aggressively intellectual, with an emphasis on game theory and probabilistic thinking. Sam thrived there. He was promoted quickly. He earned a reputation for being able to identify arbitrage opportunities that nobody else could see. But he was also restless. The money was good, but it was not enough. He had discovered a philosophy called effective altruism, which argued that the most ethical thing a person could do was earn as much money as possible, then give it away to the most effective charities. Sam wanted to save the world, and to do that, he needed more money than Jane Street could provide. In September 2017, he left Jane Street. He moved to Berkeley, California, where he briefly worked at the Center for Effective Altruism. But he was not there to be an employee. He was there to find investors for a new venture, a cryptocurrency trading firm that would exploit the price differences between exchanges in different countries. In November 2017, with funding from billionaire programmer Jane Tallon and investor Luke Ding, Bankman-Fried co-founded Alameda Research. The premise was simple. Bitcoin traded at different prices on different exchanges around the world. If you could move money between those exchanges quickly enough, you could capture the difference risk-free. In Japan, Bitcoin was trading at a premium. Bankman-Fried moved up to $25 million per day across international borders to capture that spread. This was legal. It was also incredibly profitable. Within months, Alameda was generating millions in daily revenue. But Sam was not satisfied. He wanted more than arbitrage. He wanted to build an empire. In April 2019, Bankman-Fried founded FTX, the Futures Exchange. It was a cryptocurrency derivatives platform that allowed users to trade with leverage, futures contracts, and other complex financial instruments. The exchange opened for business the following month. The timing was perfect. The cryptocurrency market was recovering from its 2018 crash. New investors were flooding in, and existing exchanges like Coinbase and Binance were focused on simple buying and selling, leaving the derivatives market wide open for a more sophisticated competitor. FTX offered something its competitors did not: leverage up to 101x. A user could put down $1 and trade as if they had 101. This was incredibly risky and incredibly attractive. It attracted the exact kind of trader who was willing to take big bets, the kind of trader who generated massive trading volumes. Sam understood something that his competitors did not. In the exchange business, volume is everything. Even if your fees are tiny, if you have enough volume, you print money. FTX's fees were low, but its volumes were enormous. Within 2 years, FTX was processing $10 billion in daily trading volume. From the beginning, FTX was structured to minimize regulatory oversight. The company was incorporated in Antigua and Barbuda. Its headquarters were in Hong Kong, where Bankman-Fried had moved in late 2018 after attending a crypto conference in Macau. In September 2021, FTX relocated to the Bahamas, drawn by the country's friendly regulatory environment. Sam was open about this. He said that FTX moved to the Bahamas because the regulators there were easier to work with. He even discussed paying off the country's $9 billion national debt, a plan so audacious that it seemed to confirm his reputation as a visionary willing to think on a global scale. But the move to the Bahamas was not just about regulation. It was also about isolation. In the Bahamas, there were no journalists knocking on doors, no SEC investigators asking questions, no whistleblowers walking into newspaper offices. FTX was building its own world, with its own rules. By 2021, FTX was the third largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world, with over 1 million users. The company had raised hundreds of millions from the most prestigious venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. Sequoia Capital invested over $200 million. Tiger Global, SoftBank, BlackRock, and the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan all piled in. The valuation reached $32 billion. Sam Bankman-Fried was worth $16 billion, making him the 41st richest American in the Forbes 400. He was 29 years old, and he was completely in control of both FTX and Alameda Research, two companies that were supposed to be independent, but were actually joined at the hip by a secret back door that only a handful of people knew. Companies that were supposed to be independent, but were actually joined at the hip by a secret back door that only a handful of people knew existed. To understand how FTX collapsed, you need to understand the relationship between FTX and Alameda Research. Alameda was founded first in 2017. It was a quantitative trading firm that made money by arbitraging price differences between crypto exchanges. By 2021, Sam Bankman-Fried owned approximately 90% of Alameda. He had promoted two of his traders, Caroline Ellison and Sam Trabucco, to co-CEOs. FTX was founded 2 years later, in 2019. It was a separate company, separate management, separate board, separate terms of service that explicitly stated, "We will not use your deposits for any purpose other than facilitating your trades." In practice, they were the same company. Alameda was the largest trader on FTX. Between June and July 2022, Alameda's wallets accounted for 10% of all tethered transfers and 30% of all USDC transfers on the exchange. Alameda had a secret exemption from FTX's auto-liquidation protocol, meaning it could borrow massive amounts without being automatically sold off like any other customer. This was by design. Bankman-Fried controlled both companies. He could move money between them with the click of a button. And in 2022, when Alameda began losing money on bad trades, that is exactly what he did. In May and June 2022, Alameda Research suffered a series of catastrophic losses. The crypto market was crashing. The Terra/Luna collapse had wiped out $40 billion in a single week. Alameda's leverage positions were imploding. The firm needed cash. Fast. Sam Bankman-Fried made a decision. He authorized FTX to transfer customer funds to Alameda. Not Alameda's money, customer money. The deposits of ordinary people who had trusted FTX with their savings. He moved over $4 billion in the first transfer, and more followed. This was not a mistake. It was not a technical glitch. It was a deliberate choice made by the CEO of both companies, who decided that Alameda's survival was more important than the terms of service that FTX had promised its customers. FTX used software to conceal the transfers, making them appear as ordinary intercompany loans on the books. 3 people knew about the secret backdoor. Gary Wang, FTX's co-founder and CTO, wrote the code that gave Alameda its secret exemption. Nishad Singh, FTX's head of engineering, built the software that concealed the transfers. Caroline Ellison, Alameda's CEO, was aware of the source of the funds she was using to keep her company afloat. All 3 would later plead guilty to fraud and testify against Bankman-Fried. All 3 would say, under oath, that Sam Bankman-Fried directed them to do it. But in the summer of 2022, nobody knew. The public saw a young billionaire expanding his empire. FTX was buying naming rights to the Miami Heat Arena. It was running Super Bowl commercials. It was sponsoring Major League Baseball umpires. The money seemed endless. In early 2022, FTX launched one of the most aggressive marketing campaigns in financial history. The company spent over $100 million on celebrity endorsements. A 30-second Super Bowl commercial that featured Larry David dismissing every major invention in human history, only to end with him dismissing FTX as a bad idea. The irony would become unbearable in hindsight. But the Super Bowl ad was just the beginning. Tom Brady, the greatest quarterback in NFL history, became an FTX brand ambassador. His wife, supermodel Gisele Bündchen, joined as a strategic advisor. Stephen Curry, the greatest shooter in NBA history, promoted FTX to his millions of followers. Naomi Osaka, Shohei Ohtani, Shaquille O'Neal, David Ortiz, Trevor Lawrence, a parade of the most recognizable athletes on the planet, all vouching for FTX. The strategy was simple. If Tom Brady trusts FTX, it must be safe. If Stephen Curry puts his money here, I can too. The endorsements were not about explaining what FTX did. They were about transferring trust from beloved celebrities to an unproven financial platform. And it worked. FTX's user base grew from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. Its valuation hit $32 billion. The company was on magazine covers, news segments, and billboards in every major city. Sam Bankman-Fried was invited to testify before Congress about how to regulate the crypto industry. The celebrities were paid handsomely. Tom Brady and Gisele Bündchen received equity stakes in FTX worth millions. After the collapse, they would be named in class action lawsuits, but by then, the damage was done. The celebrity strategy had a darker side. FTX was not just buying endorsements, it was buying legitimacy. When you see Tom Brady standing next to the FTX logo, you do not ask to see an audited balance sheet. You do not wonder whether the company's internal controls are adequate. You assume that if it is good enough for a legend, it is good enough for you. This is how the most sophisticated frauds work. They do not look like frauds, they look like success. They have celebrity endorsements, magazine covers, and venture capital from the most respected firms on earth. And by the time you realize it was all a mirage, the money is already gone. While FTX was buying celebrity trust, Bankman-Fried was also buying political influence. In the 2022 election cycle, he became the second largest individual donor to Democratic causes, behind only George Soros. He donated nearly $40 million, including $27 million, to a single Democratic super PAC called Protect Our Future. But that was only what the public could see. Bankman-Fried admitted that he also donated to Republicans through dark money channels, keeping those contributions secret. All my Republican donations were dark, he said, because the press were super liberal and he wanted to keep it quiet. His total political spending was estimated at over $70 million. He had plans to spend more, much more. In May 2022, he stated that he intended to spend north of $100 million on the 2024 presidential election, with a soft ceiling of $1 billion. Bankman-Fried's political strategy was not just about influence, it was about regulation. He pushed hard for the Digital Commodities Consumer Protection Act, a bill that would have given the Commodity Futures Trading Commission primary authority over crypto regulation. The CFTC had a reputation for being more friendly to the industry than the SEC. In other words, Bankman-Fried was trying to pick his own regulator. He wanted the friendliest cop on the beat, and he was willing to spend millions to make it happen. When lawmakers wrote bills that would have regulated FTX more strictly, he deployed his lobbyists to block them. This was not illegal. It was how Washington worked. But it created a situation where the company that most needed oversight was actively working to ensure that oversight would never come. The irony, of course, is that Bankman-Fried did not need to bribe regulators to avoid scrutiny. He did not need to pick his own regulator. Because in the Bahamas, where FTX was headquartered, there was virtually no oversight at all. The Bahamas Financial Services Commission had a staff of fewer than 100 people. They were responsible for overseeing hundreds of financial firms. They did not have the resources, the expertise, or the political mandate to meaningfully regulate a company as complex as FTX. Bankman-Fried knew this. He had chosen the Bahamas specifically because of its light regulatory touch. And for 3 years, that bet paid off perfectly. On November 2, 2022, a journalist named Ian Allison published an article on CoinDesk. It was not a long article, a few paragraphs. But it contained a number that would bring down a $32 billion company. Allison reported that according to a leaked balance sheet, Alameda Research held $14.6 billion in assets. That was a lot of money. But the problem was what those assets were made of. 40% of Alameda's assets were in FTT, a token that FTX itself had created. Think about that for a moment. Alameda, a trading firm, claimed to have billions in assets, but nearly half of those assets were in a cryptocurrency that FTX had invented out of thin air. It was as if a bank claimed to have billions in cash, and then you discovered that the cash was printed by the bank itself in its own basement. The CoinDesk article set off a chain reaction. On November 6th, Changpeng Zhao, the CEO of Binance FTX's largest rival, announced that Binance would sell its entire holdings of FTT tokens. Binance had received 23 million FTT tokens as part of a deal when FTX bought back Binance's equity stake in 2021. Those tokens were worth about $529 million at the time. Zhao's announcement was devastating. It signaled to the market that the largest exchange in the world no longer trusted FTX's token. And because FTT had very low trading volume, any large sale would crush its price. The result was a bank run. FTX users, seeing the price of FTT plummeting, rushed to withdraw their funds. Within hours, $6 billion in withdrawal requests had flooded the exchange's systems. FTX could not process those withdrawals, not because its systems were overwhelmed, but because the money was not there. It had been sent to Alameda. The secret backdoor had worked so well that there was nothing left to give back to customers. On November 8th, Bankman-Fried tweeted, "FTX is fine. Assets are fine." It was a lie. He knew it was a lie. The assets were not fine. They were at Alameda, which had used them to make bad investments that were now worthless. That same day, Bankman-Fried and Zhao announced a deal. Binance would acquire FTX. Zhao said it was to protect customers. The crypto world breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe it would be okay. Then, 24 hours later, Binance world breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe it would be okay. Then, 24 hours later, Binance backed out. Zhao said the due diligence had revealed reports of mishandled customer funds and pending U.S. agency investigations. Translation: Binance had looked at FTX's books and seen something so bad they walked away from a deal they had announced to the entire world. On November 11th, FTX filed for bankruptcy. Sam Bankman-Fried resigned as CEO. He was replaced by John J. Ray III, the same man who had spent years cleaning up the Enron bankruptcy. Ray's first public statement told you everything you needed to know about FTX. "Never in my career," he said, "have I seen such a complete failure of corporate controls and such a complete absence of trustworthy financial information." Think about who was saying this. John J. Ray had spent his entire career cleaning up the worst corporate disasters in American history. He had seen the Enron bankruptcy from the inside. He had seen WorldCom, Tyco, and dozens of other frauds. And he was saying that FTX was worse. The collapse was breathtaking in its speed. On November 6th, FTX was the third largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world. On November 11th, it was in bankruptcy. In 5 days, $32 billion of valuation had evaporated. $16 billion of personal wealth had been wiped out. And $8 billion of customer money had vanished. What made it worse was the chaos that followed. Late on November 11th, someone stole an additional $473 million from FTX's accounts in what the company called unauthorized transactions. The money was quickly converted to Ether, a method commonly used by hackers to launder stolen funds. To this day, it is not entirely clear who took it, though the U.S. Department of Justice later indicted 3 individuals for a SIM swap scam that may have been responsible. The collapse of FTX did not happen in a vacuum. It sent shockwaves through the entire cryptocurrency industry and beyond. BlockFi, a crypto lender that had significant exposure to FTX, filed for bankruptcy on November 28th. Genesis, another crypto lender, halted withdrawals on November 16th. Gemini, the exchange owned by the Winklevoss twins, stopped allowing redemptions for clients using a service provided through Genesis. The contagion spread to traditional banks. Silvergate Bank, which had covered colossal losses related to FTX, announced it would wind down operations in March 2023. Signature Bank, which catered to crypto operators, collapsed the same week. Silicon Valley Bank collapsed 3 days before that. 3 bank failures in a single week, the largest since 2008. The investors who had poured money into FTX were devastated. Sequoia Capital wrote down its $214 million investment to zero. The Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan lost $95 million of Canadian teachers' retirement savings. Tiger Global, SoftBank, BlackRock, the most sophisticated investors on the planet, all had to explain to their clients why they had been completely fooled. Sequoia had published a glowing profile of Bankman-Fried on its website. After the collapse, they replaced the profile with a link to the notice that their investment was worthless. They held a conference call where top partners defended their due diligence, but apologized to investors for backing FTX. The message was clear. Nobody had checked. Not the venture capitalists, not the auditors, not the regulators. The entire system had failed because everyone assumed someone else was doing their job. The legal fallout was enormous. A class action lawsuit was filed against Bankman-Fried and a long list of celebrity promoters: Tom Brady, Gisele Bündchen, Stephen Curry, Shaquille O'Neal, Larry David, Naomi Osaka, Shohei Ohtani, David Ortiz, Trevor Lawrence, and Kevin O'Leary. The lawsuit alleged that the celebrities had helped perpetrate a fraud by lending their credibility to a company that was secretly insolvent. FTX's bankruptcy team, led by John J. Ray III, began the process of recovering assets. They clawed back donations made to politicians and charities. They sued Bankman-Fried's parents to recover $32 million in gifts that Sam had given them, a case that was later dropped. By April 2023, they had recovered $7.3 billion of the original $8 billion in missing funds, but recovering the money did not undo the crime. As Bloomberg columnist Matt Levine put it, "We lucked into enough money to pay everyone back is not a legal defense to fraud." On December 12, 2022, Sam Bankman-Fried was arrested in his apartment complex in New Providence, Bahamas. The arrest came one day before he was scheduled to testify before the U.S. House Financial Services Committee. The Royal Bahamas Police Force took him into custody at 6 p.m., and the United States charged him with wire fraud conspiracy, securities fraud conspiracy, and money laundering. He was held at Fox Hill Prison in Nassau for 10 days. Then he consented to extradition to the United States. He was released on a $250 million bond, the largest such bond ever set in an American criminal proceeding. The conditions required him to stay at his parents' home in California. On January 3, 2023, Bankman-Fried pled not guilty. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. 3 of his closest colleagues, Caroline Ellison, Gary Wang, and Nishad Singh, had all pleaded guilty to fraud and signed cooperation agreements with prosecutors. They were going to testify against him. The trial of United States versus Bankman-Fried began on October 3, 2023, at the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Courthouse in Manhattan. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Sam Bankman-Fried stole billions of dollars from his customers and lied about it. Over a dozen witnesses testified for the prosecution. Gary Wang explained how he had written code to give Alameda a secret exemption from FTX's rules. Nishad Singh described building software to conceal the transfer of customer funds. Caroline Ellison testified that Bankman-Fried had directed the entire scheme and that she had been in a romantic relationship with him that lasted about 6 months and ended in April 2022. The defense argued that Bankman-Fried was not a criminal mastermind, but a young, inexperienced CEO who had made mistakes. They said he worked 12 to 22 hours a day, did not drink or party, and genuinely believed he was building something good. They argued that a series of mistakes, a devastating market crash, and adversarial action from Binance had caused the collapse, not intentional fraud. But the most damaging testimony came from Bankman-Fried himself. He took the stand in his own defense, and under cross-examination, his story fell apart. He claimed he did not know that Alameda was using customer funds. He said he had assumed the transfers were ordinary loans. When shown his own tweets saying FTX is fine, assets are fine, he admitted they were false but claimed they were technically true because he had been referring to solvency rather than liquidity. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. On November 2, 2023, exactly 1 year after the CoinDesk article that started it all, they returned a verdict, guilty on all 7 counts. On March 28, 2024, Judge Lewis Kaplan sentenced Sam Bankman-Fried to 25 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to forfeit $11.02 billion. The judge called it one of the biggest financial frauds in American history. Under the First Step Act, Bankman-Fried may serve approximately 18 years. But the sentence was a clear message. The era of treating crypto fraud as a victimless crime was over. Bankman-Fried is currently incarcerated at Terminal Island, a low-security federal prison in Los Angeles. In March 2025, he gave an interview to Tucker Carlson from prison, making an indirect appeal to President Trump for a pardon. He was immediately placed in solitary confinement for violating prison rules. His appeal was denied on June 12, 2026. Sam Bankman-Fried was not the only person responsible for the FTX collapse. He was the architect, but he had help. Caroline Ellison was the CEO of Alameda Research. A graduate of MIT and former Jane Street trader, Ellison had been promoted to run Alameda in 2021. She was aware of the theft of customer funds and used them to keep Alameda afloat. She also had a romantic relationship with Bankman-Fried that she later described as a factor in her loyalty to him. She pleaded guilty to fraud and testified against him. Gary Wang was the co-founder and CTO of FTX. A math prodigy who had won the USA Computing Olympiad, Wang wrote the code that gave Alameda its secret exemption from FTX's rules. He testified that with some simple tweaks to computer code, he helped Alameda misappropriate as much as $65 billion from FTX customers. He also pleaded guilty and cooperated. Nishad Singh was FTX's head of engineering. He built the software that concealed the movement of customer funds between FTX and Alameda. He pleaded guilty to defrauding customers and testified that Bankman-Fried had directed him to build the concealment system. And then there was the cast of supporting players, the venture capitalists at Sequoia who invested $200 million without reading FTX's financial statements, the lawyers who structured the offshore entities, the auditors who signed off on the books, the celebrities who vouched for a company they had never investigated. FTX was not a one-person fraud. It was a system failure that depended on hundreds of people choosing not to ask the hard questions. The question of who knew what and when is central to understanding FTX. The three insiders who pleaded guilty all said that of who knew what and when is central to understanding FTX. The three insiders who pleaded guilty all said that Bankman-Fried directed the fraud. But they also said that the culture of FTX made it easy to justify. The culture was based on a simple idea. We are the smartest people in the room. We are building something revolutionary. Anyone who questions us is either too stupid to understand or too traditional to accept progress. This belief, shared by executives, employees, investors, and customers, created an environment where dissent was impossible. And that is how the most catastrophic fraud in cryptocurrency history was allowed to continue for years without anyone stopping it. One of the most disturbing aspects of the FTX story is the role played by effective altruism, the philosophical movement that Bankman-Fried used to justify his actions. Effective altruism argues that the most ethical thing a person can do is earn as much money as possible, then give it to the most effective charities. Bankman-Fried embraced this philosophy publicly. He signed the Giving Pledge, promising to donate most of his wealth. He founded the Future Fund, which committed over $160 million to nonprofits focused on pandemic prevention and existential risk reduction. But behind the scenes, he admitted that his advocacy for ethics was mostly a front. In a series of private messages to a Vox reporter, he said that ethics was a dumb game we woke Westerners play where we say all the right shibboleths and so everyone likes us. He said his push for crypto regulation was just PR. The effective altruism label gave Bankman-Fried something invaluable, a license to be trusted. When Sequoia Capital invested in FTX, they did not just invest in a business, they invested in a narrative, the brilliant young altruist who wanted to save the world. Who would suspect someone like that of fraud? This is the most important lesson of FTX. The best cons are not the ones that look like cons. They are the ones that look like virtue. They are run by people who have convinced themselves and everyone around them that the rules do not apply because their goals are noble enough to justify any means. In Bankman-Fried's case, that belief was so strong that even after his conviction, his parents wrote letters to the judge, arguing that he should not go to prison because he had, quote, trouble responding appropriately to many social cues. How did FTX operate for nearly 4 years without being stopped? The answer is a story of regulatory failure at multiple levels. The Bahamas Financial Services Commission, which was supposed to oversee FTX, had fewer than 100 employees. It lacked the resources to audit a company as complex as FTX. It relied on FTX's own financial statements, which were never independently verified. The SEC and CFTC were aware of FTX's activities but lacked the jurisdiction to investigate aggressively. Because FTX was headquartered in the Bahamas and its U.S. operations were separate, the agencies were locked in a jurisdictional battle over who had authority. Neither acted decisively, and the U.S. Congress, which could have passed legislation to regulate crypto exchanges, was paralyzed by lobbying from the industry itself. FTX had spent millions on political donations specifically to ensure that no restrictive legislation would pass. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed in 2002 after the Enron scandal. It required CEOs to personally certify their company's financial statements, impose criminal penalties for fraud, and created the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. But Sarbanes-Oxley applied to public companies. FTX was private. It was not required to have an independent board. It was not required to have audited financial statements. It was not required to have internal controls. This is the loophole that Bankman-Fried exploited. He kept FTX private, headquartered it in a jurisdiction with minimal oversight, and used his personal control to move money wherever he wanted. The laws that were written to prevent the next Enron did not apply to him. Because FTX was not a public company, it was a cryptocurrency exchange. The failure to regulate FTX was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate strategy by Bankman-Fried and his allies to keep the company out of reach of any regulator that might actually enforce the rules. And the tragedy is that it worked. For nearly 4 years, FTX operated with virtually no oversight. It was only exposed because a journalist at CoinDesk asked the right questions and published the answers, not because any regulator did its job. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the FTX story. The systems that are supposed to protect us from fraud failed completely. And they failed because the fraud was designed to exploit the gaps between them. Enron collapsed in 2001. FTX collapsed in 2022, 21 years apart, and the pattern is almost identical. In both cases, a charismatic founder built a complex financial structure that only insiders understood. In both cases, the company used off-balance sheet entities to hide debt and losses. In both cases, executives personally enriched themselves while telling the public everything was fine. And in both cases, the fraud was exposed not by regulators, but by journalists asking questions. The names change. Kenneth Lay, Jeffrey Skilling, Sam Bankman-Fried. The industries change. Energy, cryptocurrency. But the underlying pattern is always the same. A leader who believes he is above the rules. A culture that rewards loyalty over competence. A system of oversight that arrives too late. So what are the lessons of FTX? The first lesson is that celebrity endorsements are not a substitute for due diligence. Tom Brady does not know whether a cryptocurrency exchange has adequate internal controls. Larry David does not understand the difference between solvency and liquidity. When you invest your money because a celebrity told you to, you are not investing. You are being marketed to. The second lesson is that effective altruism is not a defense against fraud. Wanting to save the world does not give you permission to steal from the people who trusted you. And the people who present themselves as the most virtuous are often the most dangerous because they have already convinced themselves that their goals justify their methods. The third lesson is the hardest. The systems we rely on to prevent fraud are not designed to catch the people who are smart enough to evade them. Regulators are underfunded and outmatched. Auditors rely on the companies they audit for their fees. And investors would rather believe a compelling story than examine the uncomfortable data. In the end, FTX customers will get most of their money back. The bankruptcy team recovered over 90% of the missing funds. Some estimates suggest customers may recover between 118% and 142% of their claim values. But the money is not the point. The point is that the fraud happened at all. The point is that the most sophisticated investors in the world were completely fooled. The point is that a 29-year-old with no prior experience in finance built a $32 billion empire on a foundation of lies, and nobody stopped him until the money was already gone. The question is not whether the next FTX will happen. The question is whether we will recognize it in time. Sam Bankman-Fried is in prison. His company is bankrupt. His reputation is destroyed. But the conditions that made FTX possible, the lack of oversight, the cult of the charismatic founder, the willingness to believe that this time is different, those conditions have not changed. Which means the next FTX is already out there, raising money, hiring celebrities, and telling investors that this time, it is real. And this time, we might not be so lucky.